All right, here we go. This is David Nesham, and I'm here today to talk to you about conquest and citizenship in the West. And we're going to start with this idea of being off the reservation. I watch Sunday morning talk shows. My kids call them boring shows, but I like to watch those political commentators. And every once in a while, they'll talk about a political candidate or they'll talk about a senator and say he's gone off the reservation. And while this is a cliche, it also harkens back to a time in America where if Indians decided to go off the reservation, or if Lakota or Northern Cheyenne or Navajo decided to not conform to government policies, they risk being hunted down by the U.S. military. So let's not say off the reservation, shall we? Let's stricken that from our vocabulary, because that's a time that we probably don't want to be celebrating too much. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to start with two historians, because in history, it's not really a collection of facts, right? It's not really this set, agreed upon thing, but history is always being reinterpreted for new generations and for new problems and new perspectives. In 1893, a man named Frederick Jackson Turner said, "The West explains America. If you want to understand America, you look to the frontier, and it explains American development. It created our democratic institutions. It created our individualism. It made us a rugged and robust nation." Patty Limerick, writing in 1987, after Vietnam, after the Civil Rights Movement, has a different idea. That she calls it New Western History, along with lots of other historians. She talks about the 4 C's. It's conquest for her. It's not an empty land like Turner saw. It's complex. It's not savage versus civilization, but there's lots of civilizations out there. It is continuous, so there's continuity. Frederick Jackson Turner says the frontier ends in 1890, and so therefore the West ends in 1890. And then it's convergence for Patty Limerick. You've got Russia coming out of the north. You've got Spain coming up out of the south. You've got France and Britain coming up from the northwest. And then you've got America pushing across the continent more generally. And then within that continent, you've got lots of different Indian nations. So 4 C's for New Western history, and it reflects a more multicultural America, right? Indians can't just be savage bad guys in 1987. Indians are fully human beings, and they're still around. What we're going to really talk about today, though, is Eliot's West ideas. And he says, looking at the period after the Civil War, that the Indian Wars and Reconstruction are part of the same process. That the country was trying to put itself together and also trying to define what it meant to be an American. It's the same process, and I throw up this little sentence of West because it's a nice encapsulation. And what he says is, the problems that were started in the 1840s as we conquered the West, as we brought in Texas, Oregon, and Mexican America, which is present-day California, Arizona, and New Mexico, states of Oregon and Wisconsin, and a good portion of Utah, and maybe a little bit of Colorado, I'm not sure exactly. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. So we had to define what it meant to be an American. We had to figure out how we were going to make a nation out of this new federal territory. At the same time, we had to figure out how to bring back in those Confederate states, right? They'd said they'd left. We fought the Civil War. Civil War's over. They were forced to come back into the Union. Of course, Lincoln would say they never left the Union, that the secession was void, right? That it never really happened. So anyway, what are we talking about? All right, back to the U.S. Okay, Greater Reconstruction. This is just a map that shows all the various diverse peoples that were sort of brought into the United States. Cession of land between these periods, you can look at that later on, but when's it happen? 1850 to 1870. That's the yellow. That's when the most of this stuff happens, and for most of it, it's after 1865. Railroads are a huge part of this process in the South and in the West, but most importantly in the West, because the frontier army was pretty small. Right after the Civil War, we shrink this bad boy way back. You were more likely to run into a frontier soldier in the East than you were in the West, right? There's just not that many of them. They're immigrants, so you have that great irony of non-Americans, non-Puritan Americans, non-Southern Americans, these new immigrants that we'll talk about in just a little bit in the class, forcing Indians to become citizens. All right. Indian Wars, question mark, question mark. This is my provocative idea. If I came into your backyard and started shooting at you, you wouldn't call it a war, would you? And so for lots of these native tribes, they don't see these as wars. They see these as struggles for survival. The Nez Perce over here in Idaho try to get out of town. They head north to Canada. After Battle of Little Bighorn, some Sitting Bull's band goes into Canada trying to leave the place. And then, of course, we know the fate of Crazy Horse at Fort Robinson if you're a local around here, but others end up being exterminated. Red Cloud's War, and let's back it up just a little bit. Red Cloud's War is in the 1860s. It's right after the Civil War. Gold and silver is discovered up in Montana. There's forts that are built trying to assist the travelers trying to get up there, but these forts are going right through Powder River country, right through the place that was reserved to the Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne in the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. Famously, in 1866, a bunch of U.S. soldiers are wiped out at Fetterman's disaster. And, what happens? The Sioux negotiate from a position of strength. So in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, all of western South Dakota becomes the Great Sioux Reservation, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Part of the reason... Oops, I'm sorry, not part of the reason. Let's get to this. The larger policy, right? Grant's peace policy. There's a decision on the part of the federal government to try and solve this question of citizenship peacefully by creating these places, these sort of civilizational waiting rooms, right? People thought of Indians as not quite being ready to be American citizens, so let's give them a reservation where they can stay for a while, they can be protected, and they will eventually join the American populace. However, if you didn't stay on the reservation, you were subject to military harassment and maybe even attack. Critics say this is genocide. Others say no, it's not genocide because if you stayed on the reservation, then you were fine, right? Anyway, we can debate that. That's the wonderful thing about history is there's no set interpretation. Another factor behind all this is gold in them thar hills, and the Black Hills in 1874, gold is discovered. There's lots of other things. You can look at this PowerPoint if you want at your leisure. Gold in them there Black Hills, as I said. So Custer expedition to 1874 to the Black Hills, bunch of wagons, a bunch of military support, scientists, photographers, other people along for the ride, and they confirm indeed that there's gold in the Black Hills. Well, this violates the 1868 treaty. That's supposed to be Sioux land. The Army can't or won't keep out the miners, and ultimately there's a large resistance to this. It's out in the Powder River country, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. These are some of the names that you associate with this resistance. And there's a three-pronged military assault to try and force these Indians back on the reservation. Out of this three-pronged military assault, you get Custer's last stand. Previously, Custer had used audacious, bold tactics to great results. In the Civil War, he became a very famous leader, right? He was promoted several times for his bold and daring maneuvers. When he was stationed in the West, he had a famous battle at Washita Creek. Well, at least for the U.S., it was called a battle. For the Cheyenne who were killed there, they didn't think of it as a battle. They thought of it more as a massacre. More to the point, at Little Bighorn, Custer thought that the Indians would do what they'd done in the past, and that was leave. They'd flee. So Custer attacked even though he was only one of these three prongs, and he wasn't even the strongest prong. He attacked into a camp of about 1,800 warriors, and he got his ass handed to him, right? Big, massive defeat. Whew! But this is sort of the beginning of the end, right? This is the victory that they can't consolidate. Soon after, through a negotiation, or maybe more likely through fraud, the Black Hills are ceded by the Lakota. Later on, this goes to the Supreme Court in the 1980s, and it's determined that the land was taken unjustly, and there's a big monetary settlement. But the Pine Ridge and the other Lakota choose not to take it because they want to maintain their claim to the Black Hills. That's another thing I want you guys to keep in mind about all of this, right? This is not ancient history. This is for many people living. This is part of their right, their legacy. Okay. Anyway, this is an open wound for some people. After reservations, humanitarian reformers decided that the best way to make Indians American citizens is to give them individual plots of land and turn them into farmers. So the General Allotment Act, or the Dawes Severalty Act, it's the same thing, gives Indians the same amount of land that homesteaders got. This is the idea that they're going to turn them into American citizens. It's supposed to be a good thing. Merrill Gates says it's a mighty pulverizing engine for breaking up the tribal mass, but he meant that in a positive way, if you can believe that. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is land gets slowly shrunk and taken, and up until 1903, the federal government tried to do this through the treaty process. After 1903, Congress says we have plenary power. We can do whatever we want regarding Indian affairs, and this is after a Supreme Court decision. Okay, so 1889, the former Great Sioux Reservation is broken up. South Dakota becomes a state, and this is a little bit weird, but the Sisseton Reservation and Yankton Reservations had already been created. They just weren't on the old map. So anyway, a little confusion with my graphics there. Sorry about that. What happens after the Dawes Severalty Act? Indians don't get land. Indians are dispossessed. A very small fraction of this land goes into Indian hands, and yet all of it at one point was tribal lands. So we have dispossession, we have the environmental destruction of the bison, which I didn't really talk about too much, but it's in your textbook. Especially for the Plains tribes, they relied on these critters, so when they're gone, things are bleak. This culminates, this bleakness, this period of just absolute poverty and decimation of a lifestyle. It's hard to stress how tragic this was. One Lakota man said that after they were confined to the reservation, nothing happened, right? Nothing happened. There's nothing to talk about. Nothing from their former way of life continued on. Wovoka was a Paiute prophet who talked about the ghost dance as a way to do the right things and do the right behaviors, and you'd bring back the old people. The ghost dance is a movement to try and stem the loss of the reservation period. For white folk around the reservation, though, it freaks them out, and we end up having a massacre in 1890. By 1891, they're buried, and it's a rather shameful incident in the American past, if you ask me. But it's also part of the process of making the country. America didn't have any blood. We didn't have any tradition. We all were a nation of immigrants, right? Except for the Native Americans, who would claim they've always been here. And so as we brought in all these new peoples, and as we tried to bring in the former Confederate states, we started to redefine what it meant to be an American. And we started to create these categories of citizenship. Emancipation, and including the formerly enslaved, is a high point of this. Assaulting Indians' beliefs is a low point. E pluribus unum is an invitation and a threat. So what's happening in the West isn't isolated. It's connected to other moments in this period. Boarding schools trying to make Indians into citizens. The elite in the East sent their kids to these schools. So there's a part of the civilization process that's really meant to be good for the Indians, even though it's also destroying their way of life. It's complicated, as Elliot West would say. There's also no space for Chinese. So here's a couple cartoons real quick about the Chinese treatment in this same time period. End of Rant. Have a great day. Bye.